The Planning Commission podcast is a spirited discussion with myself and a couple of my longtime colleagues in the profession. Our discussions are based solely on our own opinions and do not reflect the opinions or views of our employers, the American Planning Association, or even our alma maters. So grab a seat in the back of City Hall, dig out an old copy of Robert's Rules, and for goodness sakes, read your packet. The Planning Commission is now in session.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to, oh my gosh, one exciting episode of the Planning Commission podcast. We are thrilled and so excited to have our guest with us. Many of you already know who it is, especially if you're watching this live on Facebook. We've tried to make sure everybody is aware of our guest, but we'll keep this person under wraps for those of you who don't know and are listening at a later date. But soon enough, we'll get to Mr. You-know-who. How about that mystery? Commissioners, how we doing?
I'm living the dream. I have a proposal going out like Monday, so
oh my gosh, proposal
high
hell.
stress levels.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen the Elmo meme where he's screaming with the arms flaring and
That's
fire?
it. That's just like
that's
this.
been my week. That's
Oh.
all.
Yes. Oh, yeah. No kidding, right? There's been some major hiccups, but here we are, and we're gonna have a great time because our episode. Are you ready for it at home? Even Jesus himself would have a hard time walking in suburban Houston. Right? I mean, can we agree on that? If Jesus came back and tried to, provide the salvation of humanity that we're some people think he will, but he landed in the suburbs of Houston, what would he think? What do you guys think? What would his impression be of that environment? Walkable for the person who could walk on water.
He'd get so mad having to wait 4 minutes just to cross a single street that I think he'd find another civilization to save.
Oh, so manna from heaven, but can't get the ped flasher to go faster and the countdown will be. I mean, gosh, that's some serious power. But in the hands,
you're going to talk about manna from heaven. TxDOT has it. This isn't a funding problem. They prove that time and time again.
Texas DOT's got some pretty significant powers, right? So, okay, with that, we're going to talk all about walkable cities. But before we get to that point, I certainly want to make sure that we have a good time with this question first. So I want to ask you all a question, and that is: so let's assume Jesus does come back and he is in the Houston area. What's he rolling in? What if he feels it so threatening of an environment? What car is he actually choosing, or vehicle is he choosing to get around and do the things that Jesus would do? Either of you have an answer? Because I got one.
Of course I do.
Okay, what is it? Go ahead.
Well, as the minister's child here, I have to explain that everyone knows that Jesus drove a Honda. Because he and his disciples came in one accord.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah.
Dad joke of the year.
I would say a cross trek.
Oh, like a little Subaru?
Yeah.
Because it's all about love?
A cross.
Oh.
Well, I've thought about this, and what I'm going to go with is a school bus, actually. A big, yellow, flashing 60 passenger. He's got to be picking people up and he's delivering them from A to B. It's letting everybody know, stop, because Jesus is at the wheel, right? And so I think that that's what he would actually roll with. That's what I'm going with. Oh, little interference. There we go. So that's my role. I'm going to go with the school bus. Don, let's go with the whiskey pairing. What is our whiskey pairing for this episode entitled Even Jesus Himself Would Have a Hard Time Walking in Suburban Houston?
Well, I'm not going biblical on that. I know for Jeff Speck and the 10th anniversary of a book that, we know and have enjoyed over the years. And certainly, I think it was on the heels of that when he was here at the Egyptian Theater in Boise, talking about that effort. I went to find a 10-year Scotch, a Jura, Isle of Jura. It's got a pretty dry dry start, which I think most people would expect from an architect, but then it really punches you with the good stuff later. So in honor of all of Jeff's work and inspiration for us and 10th anniversary, a Jura 10-year.
Wow, if I can speak before my appointed time.
Yes.
First of all, thank you. Secondly, I'm going to there's whiskey I need to show you. I'm going to run and get it. So carry on.
Oh my
Excellent.
gosh. This is a real guess.
All right.
They really know what they're doing.
And I would be lying after the week I had with it being 12:13 p.m. here in Boise. We're recording that. So I'd be lying if I say the dram or two has not already been enjoyed today.
You know what? It's a Friday, and you're good, and you are self-employed, right? You can do whatever you want.
Sorta. His boss is kind of watching. I mean, I'm just saying.
That boss.
No, we were talking about proposals this week, and I'm gonna just put this aside. I was on vacation last month. There was a proposal due. I got it in a week early,
Oh, my.
FedEx confirmation, all that stuff. I go
Nice.
to check on the status of it. Oh, we never received it.
What?
Yeah.
Oh, come on.
And I'm sitting here going,
Mm.
an hour later, a complete emotional shift because we were the only firm that proposed on it. And they were really happy to find it in their mail room because they were worried about re-advertising it. So with all the other stuff going on this week, personally and professionally, that was an interesting hour in recognizing
Oh.
that.
Well. Oh boy. Here
All
it
right,
comes.
Jeff is back. What do we have?
Just in time. So someone gave me this. It's not Johnny Walker, haha, but
That would have been too easy.
it's
Ooh.
Wiggles Walkabout.
Oh,
Oh
wow.
my gosh.
And it's horrible. So I can't recommend it. It's actually the worst tasting. Whoever gave it to me, I'm sorry. It's just really bad.
It's like those walkabouts we do with nothing but a checklist where we never look up and look at the real conditions. So maybe there's the tie-in.
you know, I need to see that bottle again, Jeff. I think that is the Minister of Silly Walks. That
So
is
we're
who that
describing
is.
this. This is a definitely
Johnny
a
Appleseed.
dark spirit. It has a red
He's
label.
actually sowing some seeds there.
Oh.
Yeah.
So is that like a Dan Burton comment in there somewhere of the Johnny
No.
Appleseed of walkability? I don't know.
No.
It's from Pennsylvania, believe it or not.
They
Yeah.
have apples there. right?
Pittsburgh Distilling.
I would have really
Anyway,
laughed
with
if it was from
apologies,
Houston.
it's undrinkable in my
Oh.
opinion. And I enjoy single malts. So.
All right. Well,
The
thank you
worst.
for the curveball. I will say you're the first guest we've had who has brought about their own whiskey to add to the discussion. So already,
Well,
adding-
my favorite single malt comes from one of my favorite places to walk around, which is Ardbeg.
Oh,
Which
yeah.
actually I don't know where it comes from in Scotland, but I was first given it by a bartender in Edinburgh, and Edinburgh is just an amazing place to walk around. So I'll go with the Ardbeg.
Wow.
What
There you
I've
go.
learned is Jeff is a purist.
Yes,
That's what this
yes.
is. Scotch from
Well,
Scotland.
the cat is certainly out of the bag now. And so let's go ahead and transition to I just anticipate a fantastic interview with the one and the only Mr. Jeff Speck. Jeff, thank you, first of all, for being on our podcast. It's so good to have you.
Really my pleasure. And I'm going to apologize in advance. I have a cold. I'll be a little nasal and coughing, but hopefully my thought processes are still good on the Claritin and Flonase or whatever else I'm rocking on.
That's a good cocktail. I mean, yeah. I mean, gosh, add some of that putrid scotch you got there and you're in for it. So, Jeff, let's start off with the basics. Let's just tell our audience a little bit about you. I think most people who are watching probably know who you are, I would assume, but not everybody. So give us a little bit of the background of who's Jeff Speck.
So I'm a city planner who came to city planning through architecture, and I was studying architecture and architectural history in the 80s, 90s. And in the late 80s, I was one of many people who discovered the whole new urbanism movement in its early throes with Seaside and the work of Andre Stwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk. I was thinking I'd be kind of perfectly happy spending a career designing the kitchens and bathrooms of the ultra-rich, and then said, hey, there's a scale at which planning can have a larger impact on our quality of life. And that really drew me, as a liberal arts student, drew me to planning or urban design as opposed to just architecture. So I joined DPZ, spent 10 years there, worked on about 40 projects, and then had I should say the other part of that discovery was hearing Andres give his classic towns versus sprawl talk back in 1989, which you can still find on YouTube, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts talk he gave. And that just rocked my world. Basically, the idea that there are two types of cities that we can plan, and that we used to know how to do it well, and we now do it badly, and that they were very easy to distinguish from each other and very easy to do it the right way if it weren't so damn illegal everywhere. So that message struck me as career changing, but also I knew it had to be a book. So I pitched a book that ended up being called Suburban Nation to them back in '89. They eventually let me write it for them and with them. It came out in 2000. It was the best-selling book of that decade and helped to get me my next job, which was appointed at the National Endowment for the Arts, where I ran the design discipline and worked on a great program that I'm sure all of you know about called the Mayor's Institute on City Design, where we connect mayors with city planners and architects and landscape and engineers and all the great folks who make public space in America. And spent 4 years doing that, started my own practice when that was completed about 15 years ago. And so I've been working as Speck and Associates since then. About half my work is for cities and mayors, about half is for developers and builders. And the other thing that you were kind enough to mention that I would stress is that realizing around 2010 that there was a lot more stuff that I really wanted to shout at every mayor I had ever worked with, as well as planners and DOT members and the world. I had to write another book, which came out in 2012. It was called Walkable City. That was the best-selling planning book of the last decade, much to my enormous gratitude. But I think my role in this movement as one of many people who does the design work is to try to communicate it to as many people as possible. So I've always had the approach, like, how can we get more people to know about this stuff, to understand this stuff? How can we share the good word? Getting back to our biblical references, how can we share the good word in a way that it will win over more people and people who aren't normally a part of this discourse? And then the other news, as you mentioned, is right now, this week, in 4 days, the 10th anniversary edition of Walkable City is coming out. You can pre-order it now. You'll have it in days, with 100 new pages of text. So, of course, so much has happened in the last decade that I needed to comment on. And it took 100 pages. Jeanette Sadiq Khan was kind enough to write an introduction, which kind of places the book in its context. Yeah. And I really hope that the diehard folks who want to keep the conversation going that they enjoyed in the first version will pick up the second, but also that it's now staying current so that it's still relevant to folks who might be seeing it for the first time this year.
Okay, Jeff. So let's just go right into that and talk about that conversation. Why should the average citizen even care about living in a walkable city?
Oh gosh, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, but Walkable City started with this concept of why walkability, and we've expanded it since. But the great discovery I had as a planner, and maybe you all have had it yourselves as well, you can argue for all the stuff that we care about from a planner's perspective, and in planning terms, and honestly in architectural terms or landscape architectural terms. And you might convince other planners or architects, but the folks who are really convincing, the folks who are having an impact in changing people's minds in the 20 years prior that I was doing this work weren't planners, architects, landscape architects. They were epidemiologists talking about how the American healthcare crisis was really a urban design crisis because we designed out of existence the useful walk and made us morbidly obese and also much more likely to die in car crashes. Now 42,000 Americans a year, with several million Americans a year being permanently injured in car crashes. They were the environmentalists who finally came around to mapping carbon per household and not per square mile. And when they switched from the household maps, when they switched from the square mile maps, which made cities look horrible, to the per household maps, which made cities look great and the ex-urban areas look horrible, that's when the whole environmentalist movement became a pro-city movement. And of course, we all know that a New Yorker uses a quarter of the electricity of a Houstonian and a tenth of the gas of a Hong Kong person. So there's all this great evidence. You don't really need it to demonstrate how the design of our cities determines our climate footprint, right? And where we choose to live. And then there were the economists, of course, who are arguing both sides of the coin about how people really want to be in walkable places and will pay extra to be there. And then conversely, how we've burdened ourselves in most of America and much of the world with this auto dependence that is costing us here $10,000 a year to own a vehicle. Poor people are paying as much for transportation now as they are for housing, despite a housing crisis. We've really, we're blind to the degree to which we've burdened our society with this amazing cost of dragging 2 tons of metal around with us wherever we go, and the spatial costs there as well. Now, in the decades since then, I've realized that there are tremendous equity arguments to be made for walkability as well, and those have been much more in the news around who's walking the most, who's biking the most. Surprisingly, we think of your typical biker as the mammal, the middle-aged male in Lycra, when in fact it's probably a restaurant worker or a hotel worker. 38.5% of the people who are biking to work are from the poorest 25% of income earners. And then, of course, if you make, not of course, but one statistic I like is if you make $25,000 a year, you're 3 times as likely to walk to work as someone who makes 3 times as much money as that. So, walking trends poor, biking trends poor. Whenever people are talking about congestion pricing and, it's going to burden the suburbanite who's stuck out there, well, driving trends rich. So you got to look at the big picture. You got to look at the macro issues. Understand that that the driving landscape is an inequitable landscape, and also who's getting killed the most in car crashes, particularly as pedestrians. If you're Black or Native American, you're twice as likely to be killed as a pedestrian than if you're not. So all of this stuff adds up to 100 reasons why it's better for society and better for you, listener, to live in a walkable place than in an unwalkable place. And I work so hard to make places better. A lot of people I talk to, I say, look, you should move. You should move. Life is short. Life is short, and you should live in a place where you can, pay more for your housing and less for your car, and it's going to end up the same, and you're going to be so much happier, healthier, and just better off.
So I have there's so many little things in there, Jeff. And one of the things you were saying is you were talking about in the news and kind of different things that have been talked about over the last 10 years and things. And I was going back and reading your book, and I don't know what's wrong with me, but I went through your works cited and I just scanned and I stopped on an article by our former President Trump and former HUD Secretary Ben Carson. Yeah. So and what happened to me is I went and read that article because I was like, I'd never seen this. And I went and read this article. And it was really, really interesting because the article was full of reasons that suburban America should be saved, because this is where so many of our minorities live and it's the cheap place to live, and we can't allow our cities to dictate or they were talking about a federal bill dictate whether or not how our houses live and how we work. And so what it triggered for me is when I was working in public sector, I have noticed that as a planner advocating for things like this or to even suggest these kind of things, I was often considered someone who was very liberal. Like the whole planning department was this very liberal group. And it was really interesting because you're talking about the economists and things and how this is actually very expensive, right? In a lot of different ways, from everything from health costs to car owner costs and things like that. And I've always been so confused. Why has this been considered a party line issue about whether or not we should make our communities walkable? Why do I get labeled one thing or another when honestly I just thought I was coming from a data and a funding perspective, trying to suggest the best use of tax dollars, right? So I think to other planners, but not to
I think the best voice there is probably Chuck Marohn, who's a conservative from Minnesota, who has all the economic conversations loaded up about why it's the conservative and smart choice to build more mixed use urban walkable places, right? But actually, I believe we crossed a threshold about 2 or 3 years ago, about the time that article was written, when we used to kind of be able to dance around it. And I would state, and this is all I would have to say, and I'd be done. I would state that the fact that half of my city clients are conservative mayors in red states, that Mick Cornett in Oklahoma City came right forward and said to the suburban councilors, hey, do you really want to be a suburb of nothing? And that he realized that to be competitive as a city, to be wealthy as a city, they need to be the kind of place where people wanted to be. And so all the things that the studies make it very clear that there's among the educated young workforce, there's a definite premium for making a place walkable, for attracting those folks. Unfortunately, what happened was that Trump and his team came out with they're trying to take away your single family zoning argument. And I think we did cross a line, which I'm very happy to cross as a bleeding heart liberal, actually, to acknowledge that we do have this rural versus urban divide in America that's happening somewhere in the middle of the suburbs, and that car dependency and the whole automotive industrial complex trends Republican, that the protection of neighborhood character and not fearing that people who look different from you and are going to come in apartments and destroy the quality of your white neighborhood are an issue. Those were all raised by Trump, and it was all the stuff that they were that certain folks have been thinking and not saying for decades. But Trump and his team came out and basically said it, and they used it to win votes. And they really hammered on the latent racism and classism that exists in our society to use that as their point of entry to the urban design discussion. So it's almost like, they've thrown down the gauntlet, and now we can have a political discussion around planning. I have to say, it doesn't benefit me at all to have that conversation. I'd almost rather not. But I do think now that the unstated is being stated, we need to talk to planners as professionals about their political choices, because you need to understand as a planner that if you support the candidacy of one of these Trumpian candidates, you will find your work undermined if you want to be a good planner.
Yeah, I think Chris and I both here in Idaho, and the stuff we do around the state, especially outside of, especially in the red areas, and you address this in the new 100 pages in your book about just freedom and that basic concept, right? And then the other one, when we get into the single family zoning stuff, is like, well, taking that away helps the market prevail, doesn't it? And protects the property rights of others who want to have the market prevail. And so I always try to, to me, those are two fundamental concepts that in theory should bridge that, but I don't know, we're at a state to even have the rational conversation. So I mentioned, Jeff, you said it's 10th anniversary of the book. You've added about 100 pages to this. So for anyone out there going,
almost exactly 100 pages.
I already read that, I don't want to look at this. No, there's 100 pages of new good stuff in there to provide that perspective. How did you narrow that down? What were the lessons learned in those 10 years that inspired you to get at those topics? And maybe what do you consider of the new things, the top 1 or 2 influences?
Well, whenever I write a book, first of all, whenever I finish writing a book, I think I'm like, that's my last book. Like, that was so hard, and I'm done now. But inevitably, and maybe this is the last time, but inevitably there's new stuff to talk about. And so it wasn't a matter of narrowing it down. It's exactly the amount I wanted to write. My publisher was expecting about 50 pages, but they didn't stop me. And when I had written 100 pages, I happened to have been done addressing these new issues. The new issues include, of course, COVID, which we can talk about. The great misapprehension that somehow cities were less safe than the countryside, when the statistics now show us the exact opposite. And in fact, you're less likely to die in an urban environment from COVID than in a less urban environment. And then, of course, the impact that everyone's been asking all of us, right? Everyone's been asking city planners for a couple of years, what's COVID's impact on the city going to be? So we talk a little bit about that. Uber and Lyft weren't around, and they're profoundly a problem for our cities, and I wanted to write about that. Autonomous vehicles weren't being discussed. I still think it's a big stack of bullshit, but I talk about autonomous vehicles and what they would mean. I'm sorry, is this censored? This
Not at all.
joke? And I had the opportunity in over the past decade to address a plenary of the U.S. Conference of Mayors on autonomous vehicles. So I did a lot of research.
There had to be a kind of confused puppy dog head tilts in that crowd when you went on that one, right? Because you talk about the Las Vegas tunnel and Elon Musk, and it's all these salesman jobs that don't reflect our reality, right?
Yeah. And who's sponsoring the talk, right? Because in fact, my talk was sponsored in part by Ford, in part by Uber, and I actually insulted Uber in my talk, and then they asked me to come talk at Uber. So I had that experience of going into the bowels of Uber in San Francisco, and that was really interesting. And then we didn't have, or we weren't aware of the housing crisis 10 years ago. So there's a lot to talk about there. I had not read The Color of Law yet. So I had to write about that. I hadn't read Jarrett Walker. I hadn't read Charles Montgomery, Angie Schmidt, right away. Jeanette Sada-Khan's books. There's so many great writers. My main strength as a writer is I'm a good reader.
Yeah.
And so,
and I think their books along
I steal
with
from the
yours
best.
have been the four I would put up there in that decade of starting to challenge this status quo and in some cases get it to a slightly more mass market.
Yeah, I read Evicted. I read the anti-racist books, which are great. Right now I'm reading Caste, 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 which is spectacularly good so far. There's so much to learn about America and about our cities. And I always try to connect it all together through a urban design framework, which is not as hard as it sounds.
So Jeff, I'm gonna follow up a little bit on what you said. I think you called it the stack of shit. So let's just
bullshit.
build,
I didn't say shit.
Bullshit. Sorry. Let
Get
me
it
clarify
right, Chris.
on.
Come on.
Roll off the tongue.
And
let the record
and Chris, hold that
reflect.
thought. I do want to say I also had a lot more to say about biking. A lot more to say. The book that I neglected to mention, Confessions of a Recovering Engineer by Chuck Marohn, so important.
Yeah.
So I have another subchapter on traffic, another one on safety, and freedom and what freedom really means. Anyway, yes, Chris, you were saying.
Well, so you kind of touched on this, but I want to dive a little bit deeper because the real recent, because of COVID phenomenon that we're seeing in spades here is the home delivery, right? And the Amazons and the UPS. And I mean, holy cow, you can, as Don, I've heard him say a million times, you can order nail clippers from wherever and the next day they're on your doorstep. And should that really be a thing, right? So the question, I guess, would be,
and they're always parking in the bike lane.
and then there's that. So, that more last few years kind of a phenomenon. How is that affecting this pursuit of a walkable community, walkable cities?
Yeah, it's bad. But not, overcomeable, if that's a word. There's a book I really like from years ago called Technopoly, the Surrender of Culture to Technology by Neil Postman.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about the technological imperative, which basically means that any new invention that improves convenience will be adopted, whether or not it ultimately makes our lives better or worse or over. As in the case of the automobile, right? So we can't fight the Amazon deliveries, certainly in a free country in which, we don't have top-down limitation to things like that. It's definitely, if you want a little commentary on that, it's definitely kind of solidified the circumstances surrounding shopping, which is that you already had a bifurcated shopping marketplace where people are buying for cost and convenience on the one hand, and they were going to Walmart, and now they're going to Walmart or Amazon. And then people were shopping for entertainment or to participate in their community, which entirely depends on the quality of that space. And I was with Bob Gibbs, who wrote Urban Retail, just 2 weeks ago. And he reminded a crowd of us that, and he's always very like, he likes to do the negative and talk about pessimistic stuff, but he reminded us that while the new urbanism movement and the anti-sprawl movement has not been effective in every category, certainly among retailers, it has won. That the shopping malls are dead or dying, the strip centers are for convenience only. For all of the upper end or experience-based retailing that's happening in this country, for those retailers, they understand that Main Street is the way to go, and they're supportive of and they're designing new or remade traditional walkable Main Street environments. So that's been a really nice trend, in fact. But that's not the majority of our shopping. That's the majority of our socializing. And in fact, the number one thing that people do socially and on vacation is to shop.
Yeah. So I have a question about like, where are we seeing successes in the pursuit of walkable communities, and why is that happening? If you're thinking about kind of more of the recent years since your book first came out.
Well, when I started this work in the late 80s, and then I went back to school and started in earnest in 93 is when I joined DPZ. I really thought we could stop, this is where I cough and can't survive the thought. I really thought we could stop sprawl. Like, that was my goal. We're going to stop sprawl. We're going to at least slow it down. We're going to make a lot less. And I'm no longer so innocent as to think that frankly, even slowing sprawl down is really possible. And I've reoriented my approach to allowing more people to have the opportunity to live in or experience the alternative to sprawl, right? So to make more walkable places and to make more places walkable. So the question is where the success is. Again, we may have convinced the leadership of the planning profession, of the real estate industry, of governance is really on our side. We may have convinced all these folks that walkable urban places are a better solution to planning, right, than the alternative, but that's still not what's happening. But we have built a lot of places that are more walkable. We've built a lot of new places, from new towns to new town centers, that give people who don't otherwise have walking in their lives a place to walk around. A place that I had nothing to do with, but I would call your attention to, is called City Center in Houston. Do you know it? And it's basically, it was a better lifestyle center that then got a hotel and then got housing, and it's become a neighborhood. Folks live there now, and those folks live a walkable lifestyle. Meanwhile, other people drive there. Then they get a whole afternoon of shopping and a movie and dinner, and they get to experience urbanism. So there's a whole bunch of those. I mean, dozens and dozens. The American city, of course, pre-COVID, but even in some ways benefiting from COVID, has become much more walkable, much more, dineable and humane. Yeah. And you guys maybe you're not younger than me, but Jessica, you're younger than me.
Little bit.
But those of us who were looking at cities in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, have to be amazed at how cities have come back. So that trend has been super positive. And obviously COVID was a punch to the gut in office heavy downtowns like Des Moines, for example, or Omaha. But they will come back. And hopefully they'll come back with more open streets and more sidewalk dining and more shared space and more bike lanes and all the stuff that a lot of people tried for the first time because COVID got them to, right? But then you have a number of top-down, yes, in more progressive places, a number of top-down city-led initiatives, from the abolishment of the on-site parking requirement in Buffalo and Minneapolis and Cambridge, to the creation of European-style bike lanes in Somerville and Cambridge and Portland and other places, up on the sidewalk edge. We're doing new projects now where the bike, if you're rebuilding a curb, the bike lane goes on it, doesn't go next to it. So, the standards have gotten better and better. So finally, 30 years late, we're employing European-style bike facilities in our cities, and a lot of suburbs, a lot of
don't call them that. They're American.
Yeah.
We've got some great American cities coming back at it.
Yeah.
Anyway, keep going.
Freedom lanes.
That's what they are. They're free-to-plays.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
a drive-through
And-
with a hamburger kiosk in it, so that makes it a
Yeah.
Fantastic.
But you know, if you look at things from a climate change perspective, none of it is enough. But that's certainly a good motivator to do as much of it as you can. And I think even in suburbs and exurban places, you're seeing better bike infrastructure, safer, intersections for crossing.
Yeah.
And I do feel like, when I arrive at a city, and I'm often arriving at a city to do work anywhere in the country, there's a complete openness to these ideas that did not exist even 15 years ago.
Well, I think too, even if you talk about the last 10 years, even all the attention and conversation about the new infrastructure bill and finally having, and on our theme of today, who doesn't have their Pete Buttigieg prayer candle over there, we have a transportation secretary that I think could actually identify a protected bike lane, have shown a series of images on there. Is there reason for hope from that? Cautious optimism, skepticism? What do you think that initiative and all of kind of the good PR and press around this theme has done? Where do you think that'll get us?
Well, it's a first do no harm thing. And I'm just glad that Buttigieg is not doing bad things that his predecessors were doing and his successors will inevitably do. Second, we still have to look to local places for success stories. I mean, on the one hand, they're advocating for bike lanes. On the other hand, they're fighting to keep the gas tax down or forgiven, right? Which is the fundamental driver. The cost of driving is the fundamental driver of the choices people make in their communities. And you can't have a truly progressive, if you want to, you can't have a truly progressive federal leadership unless there's a willingness to increase the cost of gas, which is painful to a lot of people. And probably if Buttigieg had taken my advice on that, we'd be looking at a very different electoral outcome than we had this week. So it's not, the problem isn't that our leaders are wrong. It's that everyone's wrong. And if our leaders, sorry, I got a phone call. If our leaders want
Buttigieg
to,
on the phone wanting to correct.
Yeah, it's
Wow.
Pete.
Yeah, that's
Excuse
the
me.
hotline.
if our leaders want to, help us move forward here, I think they need to start with convincing the people whose votes they need to win. Because right now we have a public opinion that firmly will not allow the leaders to be more progressive. So it's easy to gripe about the lack of leadership in Washington, but I do understand where it comes from. And I think the point I would make is that we see tremendous, wonderful case studies happening in different places that don't require any sort of federal help to happen. That said, any dollar that's thrown at multimodal infrastructure, particularly rail, is something that I'm happy to see. I wish the e-bike proposal had passed. I think e-bikes have the potential to truly revolutionize the way that Americans get around, and they had a shot at it, and they failed this time. I'd like to see that come back. But the degree to which the federal government is going to have a major impact here, aside from giving the money to the states, which they always do, and then the states spend it on highways, which they always do, and they claim they're spending it on highway repair, but you'd be really surprised how often fixing a highway means adding 2 lanes to the highway.
And that's the part
Right.
that gets me, because those are the levels I deal with. Is we hear all that coming from the feds. They say this is attached to federal money, and then we still have state DOTs building projects in cities that don't have sidewalks.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm like, there's the complete disconnect in the talk and the on the ground application. And why can't we get to a point that I think FHWA could write the rule of, you can't build a surface street project in an urbanized area that does not have protected bike lanes and sidewalks. And if you don't, you better have a damn good reason to not.
I mean, in the
it.
same way, the MUTCD requires a yellow center line on any street with more than 6,000 cars per day.
Yeah.
And by the way, that makes people go 7 miles an hour faster, but that's in the MUTCD. So I was working in Maui a month ago, and they have to paint the yellow center
sorry.
line if they want. Yeah, it was not so bad. They have to paint the yellow center line if they want the federal funding for their street. And Ian Lockwood, I hope he doesn't get in trouble. Ian Lockwood gave me a great tip that I shared with my clients, which is that you go to Home Depot and you get some latex house paint, and you paint the yellow line in that. And then,
Let it wear off in a few months.
One little monsoon later, and you're doing great. But the point being, the same MUTCD that requires that sort of stuff needs to be transformed to first stop doing all the evil things it does, like keeping trees away from street edges, which is in the MUTCD, and to start now doing important things like Don, it's important to be careful of what you require, because the majority of bikeways in Copenhagen or anywhere are slow speed mixing streets without bike lanes. And so we need to, the way I like to say it, I guess, starting today is, streets that invite speeds of over 20 miles an hour need to have a separated bike lane or something more specific like that.
So Jeff, I'm going to tell you something you don't know. Don and I worked in a community here in Idaho a few years ago, the city of Chubbuck, charming name, right outside of the city of Pocatello, which is in southeastern Idaho. And we got to talking to them, and we were doing some training on walkability and stuff. And they told us something that was, I think you'll appreciate. They said, we know that we're not walkable. And our mayor I don't remember where the mayor went, but he came back and he bought a copy of your book and distributed it to all of the upper staff of the city and said, read this, because this is essentially going to be our manual, and we're going to begin to pursue these types of concepts. And it was quite a testament to your work, obviously, and ideas. And so I want to just quickly follow up on that with this. If there's some communities out there right now, and they're still in the year 2022, still thinking about this, still pondering, right? Your top three, the top three of like, man, if you can do these types of things tomorrow, particularly in the next year, to build the momentum, for example, what would those types of things be?
Okay, and these aren't so different from, I think, what Chuck Marone would say in his book. But yeah, it's simple. Number one, do a lane audit. No, some of your streets have more lanes than they need. Not all of them. Even without discussing induced demand and reduced demand and how the flow reacts to the supply of lanes, even without discussing that, you can identify streets that have more lanes than they need, and you can identify lanes that are too wide. There are dozens of feet in your streets of lanes wider than 10 feet that all that extra width is accomplishing is the carnage of speeding. So number one is a lane audit. Number two, this only applies in some cities, but it's literally hundreds and hundreds of American cities. Restore. I used to say convert, and then I realized it was revert, and now I've been told it's restore. Restore your two-way streets to two-way travel. Restore if you have any one-way roads that are multi-lane one-way, right? If you have any multi-lane one-way roads, or super wide single-lane one-way roads, and I'm talking both about, city streets that have 2, 3, 4 lanes. I'm also talking about, for example, in Mobile, Alabama, they've got the classic shared space yield streets of two-way travel with about a 13-foot clear in the rich neighborhoods. And in the poor neighborhoods, they have the exact same streets, but they're one way. Why?
Yeah.
Right. So those are streets that are single lane, but they're just, they could be two way. So both at the residential scale and low density, and the bigger lanes. So that's number two. And then number three, and this is often enabled by the restoration of two-way travel, eliminate every signal you can in favor of an always stop sign. Every single one. When you do that, your severe pedestrian injury deaths drop by 68%, according to a study of 199 signals that were reverted in Philadelphia. There's only been so much study of that, but every study that's been done and a ton of anecdotal data, including a story I'm about to tell you, support that. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, because with an always stop at an intersection, no one is ever going through that intersection quickly, legally.
Yeah.
Whereas when the intersection has a signal, it's very legal to go through it 30, 35 miles an hour. So I was working in Butte, Montana, and they had eight stoplights. They were very proud of being an 8 stoplight town, and they didn't want to get rid of a single one of them. And then someone hit and destroyed one of the stoplights, and at an intersection where there were regularly being crashes. And they had to raise the money to replace the stoplight. So a half a year went by, and then they realized that there hadn't been a single crash with the always stop sign in place. And that happens over and over again. So, and you understand that when an intersection has multiple lanes of traffic on one-way streets intersecting, you probably need the signal there because of confusion about who goes next. But when it's single lane in each direction, 2-lane two-way as opposed to 2-lane one-ways, then you can actually remove the stop sign.
You'll be fascinated by
signal,
this
remove
one
the
of
signal.
Your work here in Boise, and I know the interactions with Ada County Highway District. We have recently reached a point between the city and the Highway District to convert 5th and 6th Street downtown from the one-ways to the two-ways. But now all of a sudden the state cares about it and is throwing all kinds of things up to try to deflect it there. And it's just so deflating to get something that doesn't impact their system at all, but because it requires a new signal on their system, they all of a sudden care about 8 other blocks of streets. That's just
well, I have to say Boise's was I've done 15 walkability studies. Boise's was the least effective because unlike most places I've worked, every single street in downtown Boise, except for one, is owned by a county highway commission. Like, that's just horrible. Most communities own their streets, or the majority of their streets, and it's only the state highways that might be 1 or 2 streets in the downtown that you can't fix. But Boise was I enjoyed my week there, but it was an extremely frustrating outcome.
So, Jeff, we're going to go into a lightning round where we talk a little bit more about you personally. But before we do that, I want to tell you, when I was in high school, I had a lab partner in chemistry and physics, and we stayed friends for years and years. And he went into like physical engineering, something or other. I don't know what he did. And I went to civil engineering. And one time he figured out that I was doing traffic engineering at some point in my career. And he sent me a message and he goes, I don't know how you feel about this, but here's the thing that I think about stoplights. I think that stoplights were invented for total idiots. And I was like, what do you mean? Here I am, like, designing stuff. And he goes, what kind of a crazy person goes barreling through an intersection?
Well, you know, in the Netherlands, they're getting rid of stop signs. In the Netherlands, they're going just all naked. Where every intersection is a negotiation, and that's how you create a safe speed system, which you want to, have your kids walking around.
And it puts all the users on equal footing the moment you're doing that, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, Jess, lightning.
So lightning round. Okay, let's start with this. So Jeff, if you could have any superpower, or maybe you have one, what would it be?
Well, only nothing to do with planning. Invisibility is clearly the best superpower.
Clearly.
hard to argue with that.
That's just not, let's not even discuss that. That's just simple.
Okay, moving on.
It's hard to portray in Hollywood, but I think that's a universal acceptance.
I think Harry Potter did a pretty good job of invisibility cloaks, but that's just keep going.
What's your favorite walk themed song?
It's not really walk theme, and I don't particularly love it musically. But there's
you're really selling it here.
There's the song "The Suburbs" from the album of the same name by that Canadian band.
Rush.
No. Damn, they're a great Arcade Fire.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And a line in that song is just so profound. It says, first they built the road, then they built the town. And that's why we're always driving around and around and around. And I was like, holy shit, that is exactly what's wrong with so many places in America and the world. Walk Like an Egyptian's a good song too. But
we like it. We like it.
You're in Boston. Who's the greatest Celtic of all time?
I think, well, because I grew up in the 80s. I grew up in the late 70s to early 80s. So I have to say Larry Bird. I never really watched Bill Walton play. I think, though, Danny Ainge doesn't get enough credit.
The guy running the show in Utah. He was as a Laker fan, he was a thorn in the side. He was one of those guys that was tough in the 80s. So yeah, for sure.
I was also a big fan of the Chief Parrish.
Oh yeah,
Parrish,
yeah.
I just need to know if we're talking about basketball, because I have a hard time matching up the team with the sport, because I don't care.
You asked me about the only sport and the only team that I've ever really followed. So I got lucky.
Yeah.
Which
the only
sport?
I don't know anything about sports, but every time they ask a question, I'm just like, can we choose something else? But I get outvoted every time when I'm in a commission of 3. It's horrible. Anyway, keep going. Don, you had something.
Which
excitement.
foreign city have you been to that disappointingly was most like an American city?
So I always say this, but you should still go there. Australia is too far away to be that much like America. Let me just say, though, that Sydney is spectacular, and Melbourne is the place I would like to live. Like, Melbourne is eminently livable. I mean, hundreds of miles of tram-centered retail streets without a single chain store on them.
Wow.
Just all local retail.
It's funny you say that. A friend of mine, Wes Marshall, who's at University of Colorado.
Yeah, I know
Denver.
Wes.
Yeah, you know Wes. He took a sabbatical to Australia because he's sitting here going, their transportation and land use context is not that dissimilar from ours. But when you look at their traffic fatality rates, it is dramatically different. And his whole attempt was to get to the bottom of that. So I think
fun fact,
come to similar conclusions.
Fun fact, Wes Marshall's stepdad was my high school track coach.
Oh my.
Small world, man.
Okay, how about this, Jeff? So you've written some books, but you were saying that you're best you're a good reader. You're a lot of reader. So tell me your guilty pleasure, smutty books that you love to read.
Like Edith Wharton.
Good. That's not fair, but okay.
I read mostly nonfiction, mostly related to our space, right? I have to say that my favorite book of all time was probably Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, which is a really hard book, but you feel really good when you've gotten through it. And my favorite recent book is probably a book by Richard Powers called Galatea 2.2. He also wrote The Overstory about trees, which is a wonderful book about trees. But if you want to read a great work of literate science fiction, Galatea 2.2 by Richard Powers.
No, I don't want anything great literature. I want to hear what garbage you're reading. But clearly, you're above that.
I don't read garbage. I can't read Grisham. I can't read.
Oh no!
And what's his name? Who's the best-selling writer who did the oh shucks,
Stephen King.
No, I'm sorry. He's the best-selling writer of all. He writes wonderful plots, the Da Vinci Code, that guy.
Oh,
he's a horrible writer. I can't read a page of that.
Dan Brown, I think.
Dan Brown, that's it.
Like, no one even edits those books. They're just horrible.
That's true.
I think there should be a Jeff Speck book club based on
I know.
what we've taught. One, I was like, I'm going to go back and write the list of the stuff you started with at the beginning of this.
If any weirdos among your audience are curious, I went on a wonderful podcast called 3 Books with Neil Pasricha. 3 Books with Neil, Pasricha, and I talked about 3 of my favorite books of all time, and it was really fun. And if you like books, check out that episode.
There you go. All right, I got one more for you, and then we're going to give you a chance to tell everybody about your book and before we wrap up. But I'm curious, you're in a music city. I think you would agree with that. So who is your all-time Bostonian band or musical act? Who is it going to be?
That's really hard.
I know. That's why it's.
We have no easy questions here. They're all hard.
I think ultimately, it's a toss-up. I think that the Pixies were ultimately more influential than the Cars, right? It's got to
Good
be either the
choice.
Cars or the Pixies. I think the Pixies ultimately were more influential, but both hold up really well. When I was in high school, my favorite band was Boston. I used to use their music as my soundtrack when I did freestyle skateboard competition.
Ah,
we
but-
unearthed
but,
something.
Oh, we
We
didn't
did.
even get to
Yeah.
that. Now we've hit the gold. Freestyle
Yes.
skateboard competition. Now we understand you.
do you have a trophy? Is there? I don't see
I
anything
do have
on
a
the
trophy. I
bookshelf.
came in second once, but it's not over there.
It's like
I do
It's not with my planning stuff.
I
Almost
love the
as cool as
irony.
you.
I do love the irony that the Cars is amongst your, I mean, that's
Yeah,
the given, but
not lost on me. Yeah.
no, of course not. All right. Well, Jeff, before we put this episode to bed, do us a favor. Tell everybody about your incredible book. We know it's on sale, ready to rock. It's been updated and polished with a whole bunch of good stuff. So share a little bit. And
Well, I
then
think we've done a great job talking about it. Thank you very much. I do want to make an important point, though, which is that as you, and I loved your story, of course, as you related with the mayor, if you want to convince other people about this stuff, if you want to spur a conversation in your community and start the ball rolling towards becoming more walkable, then distributing that book by the hundreds is the way to do it. Thank you very much. Secondly, however, I wrote another book we haven't mentioned at all that is published by Island Press that doesn't sell as well because it's for a more limited audience, but it's called Walkable City Rules, 101 Steps to Making Better Places. That is for your audience. Walkable City Rules is everything I know with graphs and pictures and charts and numbers. I would like to think it's very readable and fun to read, but it is, I say, read it once and you'll know more. No offense, you'll know more than the typical planning commissioner. Read it twice and you are ready to open your own planning practice. So I really hope that your audience will check that book out. It's also, each rule is just 2 pages, so you put it by the toilet, and before too long, you got it all.
Well, I think something for planners in the updated version of your book is the planner's pledge at the end, and we won't spoil that for them, but for those that are listening, that's enough of a reason to go pick this up and read through that.
Well, I was wondering if I actually have it up on my screen because I was wondering if you wanted me to talk
Please.
about it.
Yeah.
Please,
Go for it.
because
We'll end the session with this.
I was scanning it and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then I realized it wasn't real yet. So I'm gonna send it in.
So do we have 5 minutes? I'm not going to read the pledge. I'm going to read the intro to the pledge.
Yes,
Does that work?
absolutely.
Yep, we can make that happen. Go ahead.
Okay. This book begins with the statement that Jane Jacobs, who wrote in 1960, won over the planners by 1980. This is largely true as it relates to strategies for the inner city, but on reflection, less accurate when it comes to how our cities and rural areas have been allowed to grow. By 1980, urban renewal was discredited and nobody smart was advocating for more inner city highways, but the juggernaut of sprawl was only gaining momentum. Anyone who has traveled America over the past 40 years can bear witness to how our cities have been continually decanted outward into the countryside, as even the most rural crossroads manage to attract a tawdry detritus of speedways and dollar stores. Sadly, this growth, destructive as it is to local economy, culture, and nature, was often guided by professional planners who administer the zoning codes and development standards that give it shape. Fighting urban, suburban, and rural sprawl, which many of us have identified as the biggest physical mistake that America has ever made, is where I began my design career, turning only later to the problems and promise of our older towns and cities. We designed new towns like Seaside, Florida, and Kentlands, Maryland, hoping that these traditionally organized neighborhoods, based on walking rather than driving, would become beloved and therefore replace the single-use sprawl paradigm that everyone seemed to hate. Only the former occurred. Every new neighborhood we built, unless expressly directed at low-income populations, quickly escalated into the luxury market as buyers voted with their feet. Developers took notice. There are now hundreds of new urban communities around the US, but each one is an anomaly, and the car-dependent development pattern continues unabated. It seems like we've tried everything, but that we is still narrowly defined, and the fight for more walkable communities actually, unbelievably, lacks the full-throated support of the planning profession. The American Planning Association, the organization that has dictated the conduct of professional planners since mid-century, has never taken a stance on sprawl. It has a sustainability division, not to mention a new urbanism division, just as it has a Latino division and an LGBTQ division, as if socially responsible planning is some sort of demographic rather than the very reason for planners to organize in the first place. It oversees planner certification and ethical standards with a heavy hand, but it has little to say about the shape of our communities. I can't suggest with any confidence that transforming the planning profession from rubber stamping enablers into anti-sprawl warriors will be enough to reverse 75 years of poor decisions, but it seems worth a shot. As a fellow of the organization, at least until they read this, I would like here to launch a campaign to make this change. Jumping well ahead to its conclusion, I have proposed a first draft of the open letter that a properly reformed APA would issue to its membership and the media. It contains, in addition to a long overdue mea culpa, something I am calling the planner's pledge, a commitment each planner would make to plan well and not badly. It's a first draft, but I welcome the APA to run with it. And I won't read any further, but you get the idea. I had a lot of fun writing it. And actually, it was done as a exercise, a writing exercise, but I'm not saying I won't pursue it. I'm not saying that, I'd kind of hope that other people might pursue it, but the idea to actually create such a movement within our profession, I think isn't something I would back away from.
And that's not lost on us either. If you've listened to either some of the episodes, I don't know if you know Tim Keene, formerly in Atlanta, now in Boise.
Quite well, yeah.
As well as kind of our riff session on the whole specter of AICP. I think we're very much in that camp of we need a shaking at a core to help write these things. So I think, and we've heard a lot of accolades from people that listen to this podcast of that's the reason they enjoy it, because it's challenging that stuff. So maybe we have you back just to talk about the planner's pledge in and of itself after you get through this cycle of the book release.
I think
Wonderful.
that Jeff Speck just kind of did the mic drop right with that.
It's over.
Yes, as our previous episode, Jeff, if you're not aware, is called Accredited If Check Processes. You can figure out how that acronym might spell. There you go.
Oh, nice.
And I am the only one on this commission that still holds their AICP, and I don't know what to do. They're probably going to take it away.
You can kind of get a sense of what team we're on when it comes to that. So,
well, I don't think, the real impediment to change is this perception of inability to change. Everyone thinks that there's a they out there. There's some they who's got their hand on the knob and is making these choices. No, it's just a lack of momentum, and I think it's not that hard.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to have to pause there. Jeff, I have a feeling that we're going to have you back at a later date, because I know that we all can go on and on and on and have, I think literally this tip of the iceberg with this conversation. But we thank you so much for your time. To our audience who's watching or listening, please go check out his book. It's available all over the place. Walkable Cities, the 10-year anniversary. Amazing, right? All kinds of fabulous things. You're going to learn more in that than you probably would, more than I'd learned in 2 years in grad school. So there you go. And it'll cost you a lot less.
I'm sorry for that.
Me too. Cost me a lot more than your book. So anyway, with that, thank you very much. Appreciate your time. Commissioners, can I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Oh, right. Second. Oh, whatever.
There we go. Thank you. See you all on the flip side.